Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show that dives into stacks of research and pulls out the core insights, basically giving you a shortcut to understanding some really complex stuff. And today, wow, we're jumping right into the deep end. We're looking at something that sits right at this fascinating crossroads of AI, neuroscience, and even philosophy. We're talking about the hidden internal worlds of large language models. They're latent spaces, and this kind of mind-bending idea that they might be mapping the actual geometry of meaning. Just take a second to think about it. These models, like the latest GPT versions, they churn out language that is just shockingly human-like. They can write poetry, that actually moves you. They debug code, answer these incredibly complex questions that seem to need real understanding. They can even hold their own in philosophical debates. It's uncanny. But what does it really mean for a machine to understand? How does it actually store all that knowledge? Is it just a giant dictionary, like super fast? Or is there something way deeper happening inside?
That's exactly the mystery we want to unpack. And it leads us straight to this key idea, the latent space. Try to picture a vast mathematical space, but not like 3D space. We're talking maybe thousands, tens of thousands of dimensions. It's almost impossible to visualize, really. In AI, especially these language models, things like words or phrases, even whole sentences, they aren't just treated like separate items in a list. Instead, through this really sophisticated learning process, they get transformed into points or vectors within this abstract continuous space, and we call these representations embeddings.
Okay, so if I'm getting this right, an embedding is like, it's a set of coordinates for a word or a phrase in this like super high dimensional map.
That's a great way to put it. A precise address on a map with thousands of axes, yeah. And here's where the geometry of meaning part really comes alive. These embeddings, these coordinates, they aren't just random. They're learned very carefully so that the geometric relationships between them, like how far apart 2 points are, the specific direction you need to travel to get from one point to another, those relationships actually mirror the semantic or syntactic relationships we understand in language.
Right, okay, let's use that classic example. It almost feels like high school algebra, but for concepts. It's the one where you take the vector for king, subtract man, add woman, and you land right near queen. When I first heard that, I was just floored. Like, wait, you can do math with words now. It really makes you rethink what meaning even is.
It absolutely does. It's mind-bending, right? It suggests the model has somehow learned implicitly that man and woman are connected by a consistent gender vector, let's call it. And king and queen are related by that exact same vector, representing a similar transformation, but maybe shifted because of the royalty aspect. So for these models, meaning isn't just a list of definitions, it seems to be fundamentally geometric. It's this landscape where concepts connect through spatial relationships, through directions and distances.
So our mission for this deep dive is clear. We're going to explore this incredible hidden world inside AI, these latent spaces. We want to understand how these structures work, how they might actually resemble the way we represent knowledge in our own minds, and ultimately how this could challenge our basic understanding of meaning, thought, and maybe even reality itself. It's a trip into the architecture of understanding. Okay, let's start mapping this out. How do these large language models actually create this internal cartography? How do they build these latent spaces and generate embeddings in practice?
Well, at the most basic level, any LLM takes language. Could be whole words, could be parts of words, what we call subword tokens, like the ing in running, and it converts these discrete units into continuous vectors, numbers basically. This conversion happens in layers called embedding layers, and crucially, these aren't hand-coded, they're learned. The model figures them out by processing just immense amounts of text data. And once you have these initial vectors, they get passed deeper into the model through more complex layers where they get refined and manipulated.
Can you give us some solid examples? Like, how does a model like GPT or maybe BERT actually do this? What's happening under the engine?
Sure. Let's take GPT, the generative pre-trained transformer. That's a good one to start with. When you give it some text, like a sentence, each piece, each token, gets mapped to a vector in this super high-dimensional space. Think maybe 768 dimensions for older models, up to like 12,000 or more for newer ones. It's huge. But here's the key thing. These initial embeddings aren't fixed. As they travel through the model's layers, through things called self-attention and feed-forward networks, they get contextually enriched. So the vector for a word actually changes depending on the words around it in that specific sentence. Remember, GPT's main job is to predict the next word.
Right.
So it essentially calculates how similar the final context-aware embedding of the current sequence is to the embeddings of all the possible words that could come next. The closest match in this space. That's the word it's most likely to predict.
Wow, okay, so the meaning, or the representation of a word, isn't static like in a dictionary. It actually morphs based on the context it's sitting in.
Exactly. And then you have models like BERT, bidirectional encoder representations from transformers. BERT takes that contextualization even further. It also starts with embedding layers, but its special trick is that it looks at the entire sentence at once, both what comes before and what comes after a word, to figure out its meaning in that context. BERT is often trained by masking out words, hiding them, and then forcing the model to predict what's missing.
Ah, like a fill-in-the-blanks game.
Kind of, yeah, but a very sophisticated one.
Yeah.
This forces it to develop really robust bidirectional contextual embeddings. It learns how words relate to everything else in the sentence, not just what came before.
It's really something how these models, even with different goals, GPT generating, BERT filling blanks, they both end up creating these incredibly rich, latent maps that encode so much structure, so much meaning. It feels like they're stumbling onto something fundamental about language.
It is pretty remarkable. And you can actually see this geometry taking shape, even in the early layers. Researchers have looked at this. Even the initial embeddings show structure. Synonyms tend to cluster together. Words with similar grammatical roles group up. Imagine plotting these points, but, thousands of dimensions. Words with similar meanings would just naturally be neighbors in that space.
And you mentioned earlier this idea of a specific direction for concepts like pluralization. Like you could literally draw an arrow from cat to cats. That's wild.
It is wild. But yeah, that's the kind of structure they find. It's as if concepts like plurality or maybe tense or gender are learned as consistent, reusable directions within this space. And it's not just words. For models like BERT, people look at sentence embeddings, a single vector trying to capture the whole meaning of a sentence. There are even specialized versions, like Sentence BERT, designed just for that. And when you plot those embeddings, they cluster by topic or overall meaning. It shows a coherent semantic space at the sentence level, too.
This all sounds incredibly similar to the distributional hypothesis from linguistics. That's been around for ages, hasn't it?
Absolutely, spot on. The distributional hypothesis, going back to folks like Zellick-Harris and John Firth in the 1950s, their core idea was simply, words that appear in similar contexts tend to have similar meanings. You shall know a word by the company it keeps, as Firth famously put it. And modern neural models like Word2Vec from around 2013 or Glove, they're essentially super-powered computational ways of proving that hypothesis right. They derive all this rich semantic structure just by looking at word usage patterns in massive text data sets. That's exactly where that king minus man plus woman equals queen result came from. It showed vector math could capture meaning analogies.
Okay, so those early models give us static embeddings, one fixed vector per word. But the real leap was moving to contextual meaning with these transformer models. How big a deal was that shift?
Oh, it was huge, a complete game changer. Static embeddings just couldn't handle polysemy well words with multiple meanings. Think about bank. I went to the bank. Financial institution. The riverbank. Totally different meaning. With static embeddings, bank just had one vector trying to average those meanings somehow, which isn't great. But with transformers, thanks to those self-attention mechanisms that came along around 2017, the embedding for bank becomes different depending on which sentence it's in. The model figures out from the context, money versus river, which meaning is intended and creates a distinct vector for it. It disambiguates on the fly.
That feels so much closer to how we use language, doesn't it? Our understanding of a word isn't fixed. It's totally flexible, totally dependent on context. My mental bank shifts instantly based on the sentence.
Precisely. And this isn't just a nice analogy, there's actual empirical evidence now. Some really cool research by Goldstein and colleagues just recently in 2024. They did this incredible study where they recorded electrical signals directly from people's brains, intracranial signals from the inferior frontal gyrus, a key language area. They did this while the participants just listened to natural speech. And from these brain signals, they derived what they called brain embeddings. And what they found was just amazing, a real geometric resemblance between these brain embeddings and the contextual LLM embeddings.
Wow.
Yeah, and importantly, it was the contextual embeddings, the ones that shift with meaning, that explained the brain data way better than the old static ones. It strongly suggests our own brains might be using something very much like these continuous context-dependent representations. It's like our neurons are doing their own version of attention.
So even though these LLMs are trained on seemingly simple tasks, like just guess the next word or fill in the blank, they're somehow learning not just grammar, the syntax, but also a ton of semantics, the actual meaning, world knowledge, and even pragmatics, like how language is used in context. It's staggering how much gets packed into these latent spaces implicitly.
It really is. They don't get fed explicit rules for semantics or pragmatics. It just sort of emerges from the statistical patterns in the text data. It's a powerful demonstration of what pattern recognition can achieve at massive scale.
Okay, this naturally leads us to an even bigger, maybe more mind-bending question. This idea of a universal latent space geometry. If different LLMs, different architectures, different training data, different sizes, if they all learn to map meaning in a way that somehow aligns, if they find the same underlying shape of meaning, what does that imply?
This is where things get really fascinating and frankly quite profound. The core question is the semantic structure learned by one model fundamentally the same as the structure learned by another, even if they look totally different on the inside or learned from different books, basically? And some groundbreaking research by Jaha and colleagues, very recent, 2025, they tackled this head on. They developed a method they call vec-to-vec. What it does is align the embedding spaces of different models, but here's the kicker. It does it in a completely unsupervised way.
Unsupervised, meaning?
Meaning they didn't give it any examples of the same sentence processed by both models. No Rosetta Stone, no dictionary between them. The models had to figure out how to translate between their internal languages all on their own just by looking at the overall structure.
That sounds almost impossible. So Model A's internal point for, democracy could be translated accurately into Model B's point for democracy without any shared reference point, just based on how democracy relates to everything else in each model space.
Exactly, that's the claim. And the results were really striking. They showed that the relative geometry, the shape of the relationships between concepts, is remarkably similar across diverse models. I'm quoting here. Our unsupervised approach translates any embedding to and from a universal latent representation. Our translations achieve high cosine similarity across model pairs with different architectures, parameter counts, and training data sets. It's not just a vague similarity, it's a deep structural alignment.
That's huge. It suggests there might be this kind of latent interlingua, a common universal structure that all these different model spaces are isomorphic to, like they have the same fundamental shape, even if the coordinate system is different. Like they're all mapping the same hidden continent of meaning, just using slightly different projection techniques.
That's a perfect analogy. And this led Shaw and his team to propose what they call the Platonic representation hypothesis. The idea is that maybe there's an ideal universal representation of meaning out there, like a Platonic form, and all sufficiently powerful models, when trained on language, naturally converge towards discovering the same underlying structure. They even suggest a stronger version, that neural nets trained on the same kind of task, like language prediction, even with different data and architectures, will inevitably converge to a universal latent space. And this space is so universal that you can translate between models without needing any explicit links or paired examples.
So it's like comparing different human languages, maybe English and Japanese. They look totally different on the surface, different words, grammar, but you can translate between them because the underlying concepts and the relationships between those concepts are, broadly shared or alignable. Here, the languages are the internal representations of different AI models, and they seem to share this deep structural grammar that allows for translation.
Exactly. It suggests that if you build a system complex enough to learn the deep statistical regularities of language, it naturally settles into a representation of meaning that's organized in a fundamentally similar geometric way, regardless of the specific implementation details.
That has some pretty interesting practical implications, frankly. Maybe for security. If someone got hold of a bunch of embeddings from a model, could they potentially figure out the original text even without having the model itself, just by knowing this universal structure exists?
Yeah, there are definitely security angles to consider, like inferring information from leaked vector databases, but also potential upsides, like making different AI systems talk to each other more easily. But the deeper implication, I think, is conceptual. It reinforces this idea that the shape of meaning, the relative distances and directions between concepts, might be consistent. So the distance between apple and orange compared to apple and car might be proportionally very similar in two completely different model spaces. Even if the raw numbers are different, the structure holds.
I guess there are limits, though. You mentioned this alignment wasn't trivial, it needed fancy techniques. And does this universality hold if the models are trained on really different kinds of text, like code versus poetry? Or does it go beyond text?
Those are exactly the right questions, and they're big open research areas. The JAWS study focused on models trained on similar large text datasets. So does it extend to aligning, say, a model trained on legal documents with one trained on song lyrics? Or aligning a language model with an image model? That's less clear. But the fact that alignment works so well within the language domain using these unsupervised methods strongly thinks that there is a profound shared structure there, one that's deeper than just the specific architecture. It makes you ask, what is that structure?
Right. So if these different AI models, built independently, are converging on the same shape of meaning, what does that tell us about language itself? Or maybe even about thought? Is it like they're discovering some fundamental organizing principle of meaning that exists sort of objectively?
It really forces you to wonder, are they tapping into some kind of deeper, maybe Platonic structure of meaning? Or does it simply reflect the inherent structure of human language and cognition, which, after all, generated the data they learned from? It could be a bit of both, couldn't it? Maybe human language itself evolved to be this efficient, geometrically organized system, and the AIs are just learning to mirror that inherent organization incredibly well.
Let's pull on that thread because it leads right to the next really big question. Do our own brains use a similar geometry? We feel like we organize thoughts, we see patterns, but what's the actual science say?
Well, the science is increasingly suggesting, yeah, quite possibly. That Goldstein study from 2024 we mentioned earlier, that's a really key piece of evidence. Remember, they recorded directly from the brain's language regions while people listened to speech.
Right, the intracranial signals.
Exactly. And they managed to derive brain embeddings from that raw neural activity. And the striking finding was the geometric similarity between those brain embeddings and the contextual LLM embeddings. They literally said brain embeddings in the IFG and the DLM contextual embedding space have common geometric patterns. And again, the crucial part was contextual. The dynamic, flexible LLM representations match the brain activity better than the old static ones.
It's pretty stunning. A direct, measurable parallel.
It is. It strongly suggests our own language processing might really operate in this embedding-like, context-dependent way. Our brains aren't just flipping switches for words. They seem to be creating these continuous distributed patterns where the geometry encodes the meaning, and that meaning shifts fluidly with context.
So this isn't just a metaphor anymore. It's pointing towards the idea that human thought might actually involve computations in these high-dimensional vector spaces inside our heads.
Precisely. This gives a lot of fuel to what some neuroscientists call the vector space neural code hypothesis. The idea is that groups of neurons work together to represent information as vectors in a high-dimensional space. And thinking, reasoning, understanding, these might be processes of moving through that space, performing geometric transformations on those neural vectors. It fits really well with methods like representational geometry, where scientists compare the shape of neural activity patterns to the shape of model representations. They're asking if thoughts literally have a similar structure in minds and machines.
And does this idea extend beyond just language? What about vision, or maybe even how we plan movements?
Oh, absolutely. Think about vision. Deep learning models for images like CNNs or vision transformers, they also learn rich latent spaces. The internal activation patterns can be seen as image embeddings. And sure enough, images of similar things, like all pictures of cats cluster together in that space, and the human brain in high-level visual areas, neuroscientists find similar clustering. Neurons that respond to faces grouped together, neurons for places grouped together. It looks very much like a geometrically organized space. Even for motor control, there's research suggesting the brain might represent possible movements as points in a continuous motor space, and planning a movement involves charting a path through that space.
So it's not just separate spaces for vision, language, motor control. The really exciting idea is that maybe these are all connected. Like, is there a higher level common space where sight and sound and words all meet?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's a leading hypothesis. Cognitive scientists talk about modal semantic hubs, brain regions that might act as convergence zones. They take information from different senses and from language and integrate it into unified abstract concepts. The anterior temporal lobe, the ATL, is often pointed to as a likely candidate. Imagine the ATL hosting a space where the pure concept of dog exists, regardless of whether you just saw one, heard barking, read the word, or remembered petting one. It's the abstract essence of dogness.
Like those concept cells they found. The Jennifer Aniston neuron that fires whether you see her picture or read her name.
Exactly like those. Those neurons might be markers within this multimodal conceptual space, representing the abstract entity itself. And guess what? AI has a direct parallel here too. Multimodal embedding spaces. Think about CLIP from OpenAI back in 2021. CLIP was trained specifically to align images and text descriptions. It creates a shared latent space where a photo of a sunset and the caption, "A beautiful sunset over the ocean," get mapped to points that are incredibly close together. In CLIP space, the image vector and the text vector for the same concept are almost interchangeable.
And that's huge because it tackles that classic philosophical problem head on, right? The symbol grounding problem. How do abstract words connect to the real messy sensory world?
It absolutely does. CLIP offers a computational way to ground language symbols in visual reality, at least. It bridges that gap. For you listening, imagine an AI that doesn't just know the dictionary definition of heavy, but can also associate it with the visual effort of lifting something large or the feeling of strain. That's the kind of grounding we're talking about.
This sounds a lot like what Jan LeCun argues for, combining predictive world models with language models, like his JPA architecture idea.
Precisely. LeCun's vision with JPA and similar ideas is about learning representations that aren't just based on language, but are fundamentally grounded in predicting how the world behaves, predicting sensory inputs. The goal is to have AI representations that understand physics, causality, object permanence, things learned from interacting with or observing the world, not just reading about it.
So the really big implication here, if there's universal geometry for language, maybe there's an even more universal geometry tying together. Language, perception, action, everything. That would really support the idea that cognition is fundamentally structural. That the pattern of relationships, the shape of the data is what matters most for meaning, not the specific sensory format.
It really points that way. It suggests that underlying all the complexity of our senses and language, there might be this elegant shared framework, this common geometric language of thought. It connects to ideas like conceptual metaphors too, how we understand abstract ideas like argument in terms of physical concepts like war. That suggests deep mappings between different representational spaces.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly and dive into maybe the most provocative idea we'll touch on today. This hypothesis that language might actually be autonomous, self-contained, which kind of flies in the face of intuition.
It's definitely a radical departure, and LLMs themselves are exhibit A for this argument, even if it's controversial. Look at how much they can do: answer questions, write code, generate creative text based only on text input. They have no bodies, no senses, no direct world experience. This success has led some researchers, like Elon Barinholtz, to push this idea of linguistic anti-realism.
So Barinholtz is basically saying language is its own thing. It can operate just fine without needing to constantly point to things in the outside world, like a self-contained game.
That's the gist of it, yeah. He argues that language, as a computational system, fundamentally doesn't really know what it's talking about, in the sense of having grounded referential meaning. In his view, symbols in language get their meaning purely from how they relate to other symbols within the system. It's all internal structure. But, he argues, this self-referential system is incredibly powerful for communication. It lets us, as he puts it, express anything in such a way that my mind can make your mind do stuff. He sees the surprising power of LLMs as proof that this structural meaning, derived from something as simple as next token prediction, is actually the core of language's effectiveness.
And it goes even further, right? Claiming that predicting the next word might be the fundamental algorithm for human language, maybe even for thought itself. That's a huge claim.
It's his central, boldest claim. The idea is that this simple predictive mechanism, when scaled up with massive data and compute, is sufficient for all the complex features of language syntax, coherence, narrative to just spontaneously emerge. And this ties in quite nicely with the predictive processing idea in cognitive science, that our brains are constantly predicting what's coming next, whether it's sensory input or the next word in a sentence. If our own thinking involves some kind of internal sequential generation of symbols based on prediction, then maybe these autoregressive LLMs aren't just an analogy. Maybe they capture something core about the process.
But if the system is just predicting patterns, as Barinholtz argues, then he says there's no way to cram any other kind of grounding in there at all. So the LLM isn't missing something. It has captured what language is this formal relational system.
That's the heart of his anti-realism. For him, the rich meaning we experience, especially the connection to senses, is kind of projected onto language by our other systems, our perceptual systems. He uses the example of red. For us, red is tied to that visual sensation. Barinholtz suggests we have that mapping in our animal embedding, our sensory system. But language itself just has a token red that's connected to other tokens like color, apple, blood, stop. A person blind from birth can still use the word red perfectly well in language, understanding its relationships to other concepts without ever having the visual qualia. They grasp its linguistic role.
So in this view, language and perception are distinct systems. They hand off information, but they don't fundamentally merge into one thing. It definitely echoes some philosophical traditions, pragmatism, anti-representationalism like Rorty or Wittgenstein, even structuralist linguistics, where meaning comes from internal relations, not external pointers. It makes you question if words really need to point directly at things.
Barinholtz would argue strongly that they don't. The symbol grounding problem sort of dissolves if symbols primarily get their power from their position within the linguistic network itself, not from direct intrinsic grounding in the world.
Great, that's a really compelling, if radical, perspective. But it definitely faces pushback. The whole stochastic parrots critique is a big one, right? That these models just mimic language without real understanding.
Absolutely. The stochastic parrots argument from Bender and colleagues and others is the main counterpoint. It says LLMs are brilliant at learning statistical correlations in text, which lets them generate fluent output, but they lack true semantics, genuine comprehension. And the most obvious evidence cited is hallucinations. Models confidently spitting out nonsense or falsehoods because the pattern sounds right, even if it contradicts reality. They have no external reality check beyond the statistical plausibility of the word sequence.
Right. Their internal meaning mixes up facts, fiction, maybe even biases present in the training data, because it's all just statistical relationships in the vector space. They can't easily distinguish true from false, like humans can, using perception or world knowledge.
Exactly, and this connects to a deeper philosophical point.
Yeah.
The difference between intention and extension. LLM embeddings seem great at capturing intentional meaning the web of conceptual relations, like how cat relates to feline or mammal. But critics argue they lack extensional meaning, the ability to connect the concept cat to actual specific cats out there in the world. Without that link to real-world reference, the argument goes, semantics is incomplete. It's a map without a territory.
And just comparing them to humans, there are other gaps. They might have amazing short-term textual memory, but they lack our common sense, our intuitive physics, our embodied understanding that stops us from saying completely absurd things.
For sure. An LLM might write a story where someone casually walks through a wall if that fits a common fantasy pattern it learned. A human instantly knows that's physically impossible based on lived experience. This is Jan LeCun's point again. Current LLMs lack integrated world models. They don't inherently understand how the physical world works. So even if there's a universal geometry learned from text, it might just be a universal geometry of linguistic patterns, not a universal geometry of reality or cognition more broadly.
What about things like abstract reasoning or solving novel puzzles without very specific prompts? They still seem to struggle with that systematically, don't they?
They often do, yes. While techniques like chain of thought prompting can elicit impressive reasoning steps, critics like Gary Marcus point out that it often feels like the model needs to be led by the hand. It suggests the underlying compositional rules, the ability to flexibly combine concepts in novel, logical ways, might not be as deeply internalized or robust as in human cognition. They're amazing pattern matchers, but maybe not yet systematic reasoners in the same way.
So how do we square Barinholtz's anti-realism with the simple fact that language works so well for us in the real world? If it were totally disconnected, how could it be useful?
That's the crux of the counter-argument. The radio problem idea mentioned by Bisk and others is relevant here. They argue communication relies on shared experience. Kids learn language by connecting words to things they see and touch. You can't really learn language just listening to the radio in a dark room. LLMs kind of cheated. They learned from language already produced by humans who did have that shared experience and grounded understanding. So the models are essentially inheriting the grounding implicitly done by generations of humans.
So they're riding on the coattails of human grounding without having to do the hard work themselves. Which makes you wonder if there's a ceiling to their understanding if they remain purely text-based.
It seems likely. And then there's the whole issue of embodiment and emotion. Barinholtz himself admits language doesn't capture the feeling of pain or pleasure or redness the qualia. That lives in our animal embedding, our non-linguistic embodied self. Current LLMs are purely informational. They have no body, no feelings, no motivations beyond prediction. They're apathetic, which arguably limits their understanding to something different, maybe shallower than ours.
And back to that universality finding from Jha et al. It was shown for language models on text. But would it hold between, say, a code writing model and a poetry model? Or between language and protein structures? Is it one universal space?
The scope is a big question mark. It seems more likely that there are multiple complex geometries, perhaps with deep structural similarities and potential mappings between them, rather than one single monolithic space for absolutely everything. Plus, meaning itself is so fluid and context-dependent. Any fixed universal geometry is bound to be an approximation of a much more dynamic reality.
And a really crucial point, even if these latent spaces encode vast knowledge, they don't inherently encode ethics, values, or consequences.
That's a critical limitation. Embeddings can easily pick up and reflect societal biases present in the training data, simply because those patterns exist in the text. The model isn't biased in a human sense, but it reproduces the statistical correlations, including harmful ones. The latent space is morally blind. It models language as it is, not as it should be. This is why AI alignment research is so vital. Figuring out how to imbue these systems with or make them responsive to human values is essential if they're going to be deployed safely and beneficially.
One last point of caution, maybe even that exciting brain LLM alignment. Could there be simpler explanations? Maybe it's just shared word associations, not necessarily shared deep structure.
That's a fair point for scientific skepticism. Simpler models also show some correlation with brain activity, just not as strong as the big contextual ones. So while the alignment is compelling evidence, we shouldn't jump to concluding the brain is a transformer. The underlying biological mechanisms might be quite different, even if they produce superficially similar representational geometries. Caution is needed.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot of ground. The amazing internal maps in AI, the echoes in our brains, this radical idea of language being its own system, and all the crucial counterpoints about grounding and limits. It feels like a lot of fascinating pieces. How do we start putting them together?
That's exactly the challenge, right? How do we synthesize all this? It led us to think about a potential unifying framework, something we're tentatively calling the Unified Cognitive Latent Space Hypothesis, or UCLS.
UCLS, Unified Cognitive Latent Space. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the core idea?
The core idea is to imagine, like a central hub for all kinds of knowledge and experience. Not just words, but sights, sounds, maybe emotions, bodily sensations. The UCLS hypothesis suggests there's a big, multimodal, probably hierarchical latent space that forms the foundation for all our different cognitive abilities: language, perception, motor control, maybe even feeling. And crucially, both human brains, and we predict truly advanced future AI systems, would operate by mapping information between specialized processing areas like vision or language and this central shared core space.
So less like separate filing cabinets for sight, sound, and words, and more like a central high-dimensional concept space where everything gets translated into a common format.
Exactly. Picture a core conceptual space right at the center. It's a modal, meaning it's not tied to any specific sense, and it integrates information from everywhere. Think of it like a geometric knowledge graph. Concepts are points, relationships are directions or paths. In humans, this might be what our association cortices are doing, creating a unified meaning. In AI, this would be a distinct layer where specialized modules for vision, language, maybe robotics, all project their information, translating it into this common language of thought.
And around this core, you'd have the specialized modal embedding subspaces, like distinct maps for vision, for language, each optimized for its own kind of data.
Precisely. Vision would have its space organized by visual features, language by semantic and syntactic features, motor control by movement parameters, and so on. But crucially, there would be learned dynamic connections, mappings, between each of these specialized spaces and the central core. So you could take a visual representation of a cat, map it into the core concept of cat, and then from that core concept, generate the linguistic representation of the word cat. The core acts as the universal translator, the interlingua.
And this UCLS wouldn't just be a static library. It would need to be active, right? It would need to support thinking and reasoning.
Absolutely. We'd expect autoregressive and interactive dynamics. Sure, the language module might still predict sequences, but the core space itself could support reasoning by traversing paths between concepts. Imagine internal thought sequences happening purely within this abstract conceptual space, manipulating concepts geometrically. It's like a mental scratch pad that's not tied directly to words or images. In AI, you could model this with transformers operating directly on these core conceptual embeddings.
And this model directly addresses the grounding problem we kept running into, the stochastic parrot issue.
That's a key goal. Grounding through cycles would be fundamental. The whole system would be trained with constant loops connecting the core and the different modalities. If the system sees something and hears its name, the training forces those inputs to map to the same core concept, and vice versa. Activating a core concept should allow the system to generate corresponding sensory or linguistic outputs, like imagining the sight or saying the word. This is inspired by that cycle consistency idea from the Vec-to-Vic alignment work. It forces the representations to be consistent and grounded across modalities through these constant back and forth translations involving the core.
And it could also finally tackle the apathetic AI problem by building in emotion or value.
Yes, that's crucial. An integration of emotion value is part of the UCLS vision. This could be separate dimensions within the core space or maybe a closely linked value space. These dimensions would represent things like significance, positive negative valence, motivation learned from experience, real or simulated, of rewards, goals, maybe even pain signals. This value space would then directly influence decision making. Concepts or predicted outcomes could be projected into this space to evaluate their desirability, giving the system actual stakes and preferences.
This whole UCLS idea, it sounds almost like a kind of structural realism for the mind. Like, what's real and knowable about thought is the structure of relations in that core space.
It definitely leans that way. It suggests the fundamental reality of mind, or at least the part we can model and understand, is this dynamic structure of relationships. It also resonates with philosophical ideas like Seller's critique of the myth of the given. In UCLS, raw sensory data isn't just dumped into the mind, it's immediately mapped into the conceptual space. All meaning comes from these learned, internal, inferential relationships, not from some pure, uninterpreted input.
So it reframes the old mind-body problem, not separate substances, but maybe like intimately linked aspects.
It's kind of like a dual aspect monism, perhaps. The body, all the sensory motor systems, and the mind, the core conceptual space, are deeply intertwined through these mapping functions. You can't really have one without the other for full intelligence. The limitations of current LLMs really highlight what's missing when you only have the disembodied language part. UCLS also fits within a computational theory of mind, but a very connectionist version, where meaning and reasoning emerge from these vector manipulations and geometric structures.
Okay, it's a compelling grand vision, but how would we actually test it? What kinds of experiments in AI or neuroscience could start to validate or challenge this UCLS hypothesis?
In AI, the path is relatively clear, though complex. You'd build a system with, say, vision and language modules explicitly connected through a shared latent layer, the core space. Then you train it heavily on tasks needing both, like detailed image captioning or answering complex visual questions. Why is the dog looking up? Afterwards, you probe that core space. Can you find dimensions that represent abstract concepts consistently across modalities, like a size vector that applies equally to visual objects and abstract size words? Finding that would be strong evidence.
And in the brain, how do you find this hidden core space amidst all the neural complexity?
It's harder, but possible. You could use fMRI or MEG, maybe EEG, while people experience the same concept through different senses. See an apple, hear apple, maybe even feel an apple. Then you use advanced analysis, like representational similarity analysis, to see if the neural patterns evoked by these different inputs converge onto a common representation in certain brain regions, like those association cortices we talked about. Does the neural signature of apple look similar regardless of how you perceived it?
And you could also test that Barinholtz idea about thought being like language prediction.
You could try. Using high-resolution imaging during, say, silent mental planning or problem solving, Can you detect sequential, predictive signals in language areas even when no words are being spoken? If thinking involves this internal linguistic generation, maybe we can catch glimpses of it.
What about that really far-out idea, latent universalism? That these structural patterns aren't just for humans or AI, but maybe for any complex learning system. How could you even begin to test that?
Well, a simple version. Train one AI on human instructions for getting around a place. Train a separate robot AI purely on its own sensor motor data from actually navigating that place. Then see if you can align their latent spaces so the robot can follow the human instructions, even though it never learned language directly. If the underlying structure of navigation knowledge is universal enough, it might work, the super speculative version. Imagine encountering aliens. If both species have learned models of shared physical reality, could we align our conceptual spaces just by observing patterns in the world and each other's actions without needing a common language first? It implies meaning itself is fundamentally structural.
That is truly mind-bending. Suggesting understanding is about grasping the underlying shapes of reality. Okay, so we've been on quite a journey. From the geometry inside LLMs, its surprising universality, the echoes in our brains, to the radical idea of language being autonomous, countered by the crucial need for grounding, and finally landing on this vision of a unified cognitive latent space.
It's a lot, but the core takeaway for me is how these models, just by learning statistical patterns in text, seem to have discovered or rediscovered really fundamental ways that meaning is structured. Concepts aren't just isolated labels. They exist in this rich geometric landscape where distances and directions matter profoundly. It feels less like engineering and more like uncovering a deep logic.
And that universality, finding different models, finding similar structures, really hammers that home. It's like there's an inherent, efficient way to organize linguistic meaning, maybe even a Platonic ideal, that powerful learning systems naturally converge on.
And the alignment with brain activity makes it even more compelling. It suggests our own minds might be using a similar kind of continuous, context-aware vector code. It's this startling convergence between silicon and biology. Are we finding a shared computational basis for thought?
But we also had to pump the brakes on the idea of pure language autonomy. LMs show how far text alone can take you, but human meaning seems undeniably richer for being grounded in our bodies and senses. An LLM knows about red, but it doesn't experience red.
Exactly. That lack of grounding, world models, and values leads to problems like hallucinations and indifference to truth. That's why the path forward seems to be unification, integrating language with vision, action, perhaps emotion, mirroring how our own cognition works.
And it's fascinating how these modern AI concepts breathe new life into age-old philosophical debates about meaning, reality, and the mind-body problem. These latent spaces give us a new lens to view those questions.
Ultimately, it all pushes us towards that really big question. Are these latent structures pointing towards some kind of universal mind-like architecture, something inherent in information processing itself, whether it happens in brains or circuits?
It's a powerful maybe, isn't it? That independent systems evolution AI training arrive at similar solutions suggests deep principles are at work. Maybe they're both just modeling the structure of the same external reality. Or maybe there are just universally efficient ways to organize complex information for intelligent behavior, like convergent evolution, but for thought architectures.
And even though human languages vary, maybe underneath they're just different coordinate systems overlaid on the same fundamental human conceptual space, shaped by our shared biology and experience.
It's clear that figuring this out needs everyone at the table. AI researchers, neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, philosophers. It's too big for one field. So let me leave you, our listener, with a final thought to mull over. If AI is getting this good at mapping the latent spaces of our thoughts, our language, our knowledge, what happens when it starts discovering entirely new dimensions in that space? Concepts or relationships that humans haven't conceived of, maybe aren't even equipped to perceive easily. How could that expand not just what machines can do, but our own understanding of reality? Charting this geometry, grounding it, and steering it wisely. That seems like the profound task ahead.
It's an exciting prospect. AI could become a tool, like a telescope for the mind, helping us see patterns and complexity that are currently invisible to us.
Exactly.